שמע ששיר חדש
Yep. Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming. And we have a lot of dedications this week. This year is dedicated praying for final victory of our Chayolim and all the fronts of the war, the lasting unity of Am Yisrael, all of those whose health has been affected by the war, the safe return of all of the hostages, Be'ezras Hashem, Refuah Shlema for Baruch ben Frida, and Aliyot Neshama for Esther Malka Bas Avram Yaakov Halevi Zechrono Livracha, the mother of Yehuda Silberberg, whose and the yard site is the 3rd of Nisan. We have other dedications in honor of Adam Bernstein's chasna, engagement to Ayala Soriano. Now the wedding will be on Rosh Chodesh Nisan very soon. Dedicated by his very proud parents, Jillian and Jeremy Bernstein, and grandparents Eunice and Lenny Morris. And again, since Adam had been a regular attendee here, we want to wish him a great Mazel Tov as well. Dedicated by Yosef Halimi for the Hatzlacha and for continued bracha and health of the family, and in honor of the Rav. The entire series during Adar is sponsored by Rena and Mark Questel, in honor and appreciation of Rabbi Breitowitz for Zechus, the safety and success of Tzahal and return of the Chatufim, and Lezecher Nishmas Rabbi Yisrael ben Raphael Zev. Again, we thank all of our sponsors for their support of Torah. May it be a zechut for their families and for all of the needs that they indicated. Finally, YIBONEH started its Kimcha de Pischa campaign. Remember, there are two terms that are used here. One is called Ma'os Chitim, money for wheat. The other is the Aramaic Kimcha de Pischa, flour for Pesach. They are synonymous, more or less, so don't get confused by the two different titles that are used. But there is a special inyan, a takana of the Chachamim, that before Pesach, because the expenses are relatively high for many people who have difficulty meeting those expenses, and there are many aniyim, sadly, in Eretz Yisrael, in Yerushalayim. So YIBONEH has a campaign to help families that will need help during Pesach. And it's a chiyuv. It's actually a special, besides the mitzvah of tzedakah, there is a special chiyuv before Pesach to provide some financial assistance. So there's a link on the website and in the description box as to how you can contribute. I assume that kind of 100% goes to the aniyim. There's like no administrative costs that are going to be withheld. It's hard to believe that a week from this Shabbos is Shabbos HaGadol. Well, you had mentioned it. Great, that's a little scary, but okay. But we'll deal with that when we come to that. But anyway, I want to talk about something that is not directly connected to the Parsha, but it's connected to the overall time of year. We've already had occasion to mention a number of times that in the month of Adar, there are 4 special supplementary Torah readings that we have in addition to the Parshat HaShavua. We have starting Parshat Shkalim, reading about the half shekel, and then right before Purim, we have reading about the destruction of Amalek, and then last week we read about the red heifer, the Para Aduma, and this week is the last of the 4 special Torah readings, in which called Parshat HaChodesh, in which we're going to read in Shmos, Perek Yud Beis, the laws of the Korban Pesach and the Matzah and the Moror and the prohibition of Chametz, which is obviously a segue, a preparation for Pesach itself. So we have, in other words, Shkalim, Zachar, Para, Chodesh. Right? So this is Chodesh, this is the end of the 4. And I want to share with you a general thought that Rav Tzadok of Lublin articulates with respect to all of the 4 Parshiyot biyachad. All of us know the very famous Mishnah in Pirkei Avos, Al Shloisha Devarim Ha'olam Omed. The world stands on 3 fundamental pillars of holiness. Al HaTorah v'al Havoda v'al Gemilas Chasadim, on the study of Torah, on divine service, either through sacrifice or through prayer, and Gemilas Chasadim, and on acts of loving kindness. It's a well-known idea that each of the avos represented one of those pillars. Avraham Avinu represented the pillar of loving kindness, and Yitzchak, who was literally a sacrifice, represents divine service, and Yaakov, who spent 14 years in the yeshiva of Shem and Aver before he went to Lavan, represents the pillar of Torah, Avoda, Gemilas Chasadim. That's a very well-known idea, very important idea. In fact, I believe that YIBONEH is essentially an organization based on those three pillars. But Pirkei Avos also tells us that Kishem, just as there are three pillars that bring holiness into the world, there are three negative forces that destroy holiness from the world. Three forces of Tumah. And the three forces of Tumah, of impurity, are also in Pirkei Avos a little later on. And it's from Rabbi Elazar HaKapor, who talks about kina, jealousy, envy. Taiva is excessive lust for the material and the sensual. And kavod, the need for glory, egotism, self-aggrandizement. So what does Rabbi Elazar HaKapor say? Hakina v'ataiva v'akavod motziin es ha'adam min ha'olam. They take a person out of the world. Now that has two meanings. It takes a person away from the world to come, because you live a life in which you're obsessed with those three negative characteristics. They wipe you out spiritually. They destroy you spiritually. And the Alter of Slobodka used to remark, it also means you live a miserable life even in this world. You're a real loser, because the world to come you totally forfeit, and your life is going to be pretty lousy even here. So gee, what's the point? But nevertheless, Hakina v'taiva v'kavod. So Rav Tzadok says the following: Pesach is about freedom and achieving closeness to God, to become liberated to serve God. And that's often described as building a ladder. Just like Yaakov, there was a ladder that's on earth and it reaches up to the heavens. But when you have a building site, before you can really build the building, you got to remove the junk and the garbage and the trash from the building site. Right? You got to clean it. So Rav Tzadok says, before we're ready for the chayut, the freedom of Pesach, we got to work on getting the garbage out of our system. The garbage is kina, taiva, kavod. So Rav Tzadok says the following idea. Shekalim will help us deal with jealousy. Zachar will help us deal with lust. I'll explain how. Para, last week, can help us deal with egotism and arrogance. And after you've gone through eradicating the kina, the taiva, and the kavod, you are ready for chodesh, you are ready for hitchadshut, you are ready for renewal, and you're ready to enter the Pesach. Right? So he looks at the four Parshiot as a very, very significant transition to Pesach, getting rid of the negatives that then enables you to be open and receptive to hitchadshut. Which is a little, again, that's an important reminder. You want to have renewal, you want to have some spiritual connection, but you got to kind of dig deep sometimes and get rid of the negativities. Because the negativities are blockages. The negativities prevent you from absorbing holiness. In the Rambam's language, they are mechitzot. They are like walls of separation in which the holiness of the Torah, the holiness of the mitzvot, the relationship to God can't penetrate because there's so much negativity. So what I want to go over, since this is the last of the four Parshiot, I want to go over very, very briefly how the four Parshiot are correlated to these negatives, resulting in the fourth one, which is a positive, Chodesh, Hitchadshut. Now, Shkalim, I had actually spoken about Bi'arichut, so I'm just going to be very, very quick. But the idea that Parsha Shkalim is an antidote that helps us deal with jealousy and envy was a theme we talked about. I'll just mention it very, very quickly, just so everyone will be on the same page. And that is, the idea of Shkalim, the Torah emphasizes uniformity. Rich people don't give more to the half shekel. Poor people don't give less. So characteristic number one of the half shekel is uniformity. And characteristic number 2 is you give a half shekel, not a whole shekel. So the half does not become a whole entity unless it's joined to the others. Now, both of these ideas independently help us deal with envy and jealousy. Because as I had mentioned from the Svat Emes, when the Torah says rich people don't give more and poor people don't give less, rich and poor don't only mean a lot of money or not a lot of money, but rich can signify the entire range of human talents and abilities. A person might be rich in wisdom, a person might be rich in organizational ability, a person might be rich in leadership. And poor can mean a person that might be relatively bereft of some of these talents. And obviously, a person who is bereft may feel envious of those who seem to be more accomplished, and vice versa. Those who are more accomplished might have arrogance and disdain for those that they perceive as their inferiors. By the Torah emphasizing that everybody is equal, the Torah is saying rich and poor, by whatever definition you define, stand before God with equality of dignity. Because the only thing God asks is you give him the best of yourself. And you have two people. One person might be really, really, really great, and one person maybe not be so great, but each of them are giving the best that they can. They are equally beloved and equally cherished in the eyes of God. And the other way around, if the person who has so many abilities only gives a little bit of his ability, even though it's much more than the other guy will be more beloved by God because he's giving more of his abilities. Again, a few weeks ago we talked about this at length. I don't want to spend a lot of time on it, but you can readily understand how this helps us deal with jealousy because it highlights the equality of dignity that every person has standing before God. That also emerges in the notion of half versus whole, because a half is incomplete unless it's joined to another half. That reminds us of interdependence, meaning everybody is needed. Everybody has a role, no matter how great. In fact, the idea of minyan brings that out. You could be the greatest tzaddik and rabbi of the generation, but unless you have 9 other Jews with you, you can't say Kaddish, you can't say Kedusha, and those 9 other Jews can be anybody, anyone that's Jewish, so to speak. The notion that everybody's needed. Everybody has a part. And that too is an antidote to jealousy and envy. Because as simple as I might be, I am needed in God's plan. The world would not be quite the same. So that's Parsha number 1. In other words, Parshat Shkalim, both by its uniformity requirement and by its interdependence requirement, 2 halves make a whole, kind of help a person deal with jealousy and envy. Rav Tzadok points out the reason why it's the first of the 4 parshiot is that envy is the most difficult midah to eradicate. You need the most time. So we got to start relatively early in order to keep on moving with it, and hopefully we'll achieve some modicum of success. Okay, so that's the connection between Kina and Shekalim. Right? Kina is dealing with Shekalim. Now we then come to Amalek, eradicating Amalek, and that deals with Taiva. Here the association is a little bit more abstract. But again, there are themes that we did touch upon, so I'm going to be relatively abbreviated on this as well. And that is, if you remember, one very important theme about the evil of Amalek is that there is an Amalek within us and an Amalek outside of us. And the Amalek outside of us is empowered when there are aspects of Amalek within us. So when the Torah gives you a mitzvah of eradicating Amalek, it certainly does refer to the external Amaleks, whether they're Hamas or anybody else. There is indeed such a mitzvah. But it also has a reference back to you to kind of work on eradicating the Amalek within me. That's part of the mitzvah as well. Because when we successfully eradicate the Amalek inside of us, The Amalek outside of us simply vanishes like a bad dream. So here's the thing. So what is the Amalek within us? You could identify different things, but Rav Tzadok identifies the Amalek within us as coldness and indifference of the heart. Because after all, the Torah uses the word about Amalek, asher korcha baderech, which is translated, they encountered you in the road, but Rashi himself points out that karcha, can come from making you cold. And Rashi uses it in a different sense. Rashi says when the Jews left Mitzrayim, everybody was afraid of them. They were like a boiling hot bath. Amalek was the first nation that attacked us, so they jumped into the bath. They got burnt, but they made it a little cooler for the next one. That's how Rashi does it. But Rav Tzadok takes the same etymology, but draws a different message from it. Amalek represents coldness of the heart. Meaning, even if a person learns Torah, does mitzvot, but sometimes we do it without enthusiasm, without passion, without excitement, without, to use the Yiddish word, without geschmack, coldness of the heart. And that is Amalek. And the coldness, of course, is not only in Bein Adam Lamakom, between man and God, but also Bein Adam L'Chaveiro. The coldness. See, when people think about sinat chinam, hatred, it's not only the hot hatred of calling people names or throwing rocks at them. That's one type of hatred. But there's a more subtle type of hatred, and maybe in English we wouldn't call that hatred, but I think Chazal subsumed that within hatred. And that is kind of an indifference to people who are not in my group, who are not in my clique. I'm not even thinking anything bad about them. I just don't think about them. They're not in my radar. Well, I know that in English it might be very bit of a stretch to call that hatred, but I think we can call it coldness. Coldness we can call it. And that's also the characteristic of Amalek. Amalek is the coldness of the heart. The coldness of the heart. Now, Rav Tzadok then says, and this may be a little bit of a tough love message, he says, what generates coldness of the heart? I mean, Torah is so beautiful, mitzvahs are so uplifting. How can there be coldness of the heart? Every time I do a mitzvah, it should be gewaldig, gewaldig, gewaldig. So Rav Tzadok says, at least one of the factors that generates coldness of the heart is an over-attachment to the physical and material part of the world. The same way that, let's say, a person who is, I mean, even in a physical sense, this is true. If you are attached, if you're a web surfer, right, you look at the internet and you jump, you surf from site to site, you won't be able to read Shakespeare or William Faulkner, a hard book, because you're used to an instant gratification and you don't get it by something that takes a lot of thought. And the same way that a person who is habituated to junk food will not spend 3 hours making a French meal, because when you have instant gratification, you're not willing to put in the effort for things that require more effort but are ultimately more rewarding. Kal v'chomer, that's true in the physical versus spiritual realm. Ruchnius, spirituality, a Torah study, prayer, they can be the greatest joys of life. But it's not automatic. It takes work. It takes effort. Physical pleasures tend to be quick. And once you become habituated to the quick, you become less sensitive to ruchnius. And even if you go through the motions, there will be a coldness in the heart. So Rav Tzadok says, when we read about Amalek, and we read about the mitzvah to eradicate Amalek, and that means also the Amalek of the heart, and the Amalek of the heart is the coldness of the heart, we have to work on disengaging a little bit from the materialism of the world. Now, I say a little bit because Judaism does recognize that we're not supposed to necessarily strive to live in poverty. If you're in poverty, you accept it and with simcha, but there's no mitzvah to bedavka, make yourself poor. And Judaism frowns upon asceticism, so we're supposed to enjoy the world. But still, we should enjoy the world, but the world shouldn't control us. Now, I remember years ago, Pepsi Cola was running a campaign to encourage purchase of Pepsi. So their advertisement was, drink Pepsi, get stuff. You could get prizes. Now, get stuff, to me, was a very, very interesting thing, because that represented a commitment to materialism that wasn't even focused on anything. You didn't even know what it is. Stuff, I want stuff. I just want stuff. That's kind of addiction to stuff. And unfortunately, we sometimes live in a culture where we are addicted to stuff, right? So therefore, you understand Rav Tzadok's point. If shekalim helps us deal with jealousy, Amalek, this is a bit more of an abstract idea, helps us try to disengage from materialism and too much involvement in the gashmiut of the world, because that will take away the coldness of the heart. Because I will find pleasure in ruchnius, in spirituality. So that's the connection between shkalim and jealousy, and zochor, Amalek, and taiva. We now come to the third idea, kavod. Kavod is a desire for honor, for glory, self-aggrandizement, egotism, etc. And para aduma helps us deal with that. Now, although Parshas Parah was last week, I did not talk about it last week, so as part of this message, I'm going to talk a little bit about it now, because this is the one thing that I did not address in prior weeks. Parah aduma, the red cow, the red heifer, is considered to be the most mysterious mitzvah in the whole Torah, and it has a very specific purpose. The purpose is that when the parah aduma is shechted and it is burnt into ashes, and the ashes are mixed with spring water, all people who have come in contact with dead bodies, only for that purpose, they get a little sprinkle, even one drop, and they get sprinkled, right, they're tamei for 7 days, so they get sprinkled on day 3 and on day 7, and then they go to the mikvah, and they will be pure, meaning until they go through the parah aduma, as well as going to the mikvah and counting 7 days, they are ritually tamei. Now, to be ritually tamei, unless you're a Kohen, is actually not a big problem, but it does mean you can't go to the Beis HaMikdash, you cannot bring korbanos. That's actually the halachic issue of why we don't go to the Har HaBayit, because all of us are ritually tamei by contact with the Met, and without parah aduma, we haven't become pure yet. So as a result, we don't go to the Har HaBayit. Again, those who do go agree that you can't go in the temple area, but they simply are more confident where that area is. There's really no machlokas in principle, meaning I'm not going to address this issue, but the argument to go to the Har HaBayit and not go to the Har HaBayit is not a machlokas about halachic principle. Everybody admits that the part of the Temple Mount that belongs to the Beis HaMikdash courtyards, it absolutely is forbidden to go unless you're pure. And anything outside of that is permitted to go. So everybody agrees on that. And the machlokas simply is, are we confident enough in the boundaries? Right? So the Haredi world tends to be stricter on this. There are segments of the Dati Leumi world that is a bit more confident in their identification. But it is important to underscore that there is no machlokas on the halachic principles that govern this. By the way, I used to think as a kid, actually even after I was a kid, that the parah aduma was a fire engine red cow, which would be very, very rare indeed. I don't think there is such a thing. But the truth of the matter is, the color of the parah aduma is not an unusual color for a cow. It is simply the reddish orange brown that is a very common color for cows. The reason why the Parah Aduma was rare, however, and expensive when they had to buy it, was because it had to be virtually 100% that color, meaning you were allowed to have up to one black hair. If it's two black hairs or white, no good. So that's rare, because cows will have different colors of hair and the like. But the color itself is not so rare. And as you know, there are people who say they do have Parah Adumas, and that's a proof of Mashiach coming, whatever it would be. Okay. Now, Parah Aduma is only for the impurity of Met. For example, other levels of impurity, like the leper, a Metzora, or a woman that's a Nida, is also a certain level of halachic impurity, or even touching dead animals. There's a certain state of impurity, but for those, all you need is mikveh. The only tumah that requires the Parah Aduma is the tumah of contact with a human corpse, either by touching the corpse, or by moving the corpse, or being under the same roof with a corpse. Which is why, for example, walking into a cemetery, you have to understand, does not automatically make you tameh. Why are you tameh? Because I walked into a cemetery. I didn't touch a corpse. I didn't move a corpse. But the reason you're tameh is that you might be under a tree that overhangs both the grave and you. So you're under the same roof. Or there is a halachic principle, your body can become its own tent. So for example, if I lean over a grave, so I become the tent over the grave. That's matame me. But in theory, if I remained straight, I remained upright, and I didn't bend over the grave, and there's no tree overhanging, in theory, I'm not tameh. Even in a cemetery, I'm not tameh. In theory, a Kohen, in theory, would be allowed to enter a cemetery under those conditions, but we don't do that because things can go wrong. And the like. Okay, so what makes Parah Aduma so mysterious? So Rashi and all the commentaries say that what makes Parah Aduma so mysterious is that there's a contradiction or paradox in the law of Parah Aduma. And that is, on one hand, Parah Aduma takes an impure person and purifies him. Mitaher es hatmeim. But you know, there's another halacha that anybody that handles the ashes becomes ritually impure. So the same thing that brings purity to the people on whom it is sprinkled, it brings impurity to those who handle it. Now I just want to clarify that though, because a person might ask a question, well, how is it possible for all of the Jewish people to ever be purified? Don't you always have last guy holding the bag? Because remember, before Pesach, let's say, when people brought the Korban Pesach, and really before all the pilgrimage festivals, everybody wanted to be pure because they want to enter the Beis HaMikdash. But here's the thing. You were in contact with a dead body, so I'm a Kohen, I sprinkle you. But now I'm Tameh. So I need somebody to sprinkle me. So now I become pure, but the guy who sprinkled me becomes tameh, right? So you're going to have like an infinite regression problem. So there's the last guy, whenever you stop the process, who's going to be tameh. The answer is that's false. And the reason that's false is the following reason. The guy who becomes tameh because he handles the Parah Aduma ashes doesn't need to be sprinkled with Parah Aduma. Because the only tumah that needs to be sprinkled with Parah Aduma ashes is the tumah of a person who touched or moved a corpse. The tumah of handling Parah Aduma is a regular tumah. All he has to do, in fact, it's only a one-day tumah, the last guy just jumps into the mikveh and he's fine. He doesn't need to be sprinkled. That's a mistake that people sometimes make. Because sprinkling is only for the tumat met. It is not for the tumah of the Parah Aduma ashes. Okay. So this is why Parah Aduma is so mysterious. And this is the famous saying, Mitaher es hatmeim It purifies those who are impure. Umitamei es hatahorim, and it contaminates those who are pure. Paradox, contradiction. That is why Chazal say that Shlomo HaMelech sought to understand all the commandments of the Torah. And he had reasons for everything. But once he got to this one, he was stumped. And then he realized even the mitzvot for which he thought he had a reason, he didn't fully understand. Meaning, it wasn't just this one. He understood that there are infinite secrets. By the way, my Rosh Hashiva, Rav Yaakov Yitzchak Breitowitz, Zechron Livracha, of the Ner Yisrael Yeshiva in Baltimore, once said this about NCSY. Again, it's a very interesting thought. NCSY is the youth program of the OU, the Orthodox Union, and NCSY works with teenagers who are in public school and from totally non-religious backgrounds, and it is a phenomenal. They have NCSY in Israel too. It's not on the same scale, but in America, it's a big organization. I used to be involved with them for a number of years, and they are a phenomenal organization. They change people's lives, and the kids grow like there's nothing, no organization like NCSY. It's a beautiful organization. But NCSY is a co-ed organization. So you're talking about high school kids, boys and girls together. The girls, in particular, are not always going to be tznius when they first come. So there's a big shaila in the yeshiva world. NCSY wants yeshiva students to kind of teach and be involved. On the other hand, it's an environment that may not be right for yeshiva students and the like. So different yeshivas have different policies regarding whether they let their single boys participate, or even single girls participate in NCSY programs. If you're married, it's okay. I was married when I was involved in the NCSY, but if you're not married, so my Rosh Hashiva, I think, gave a classic line about NCSY. He said, NCSY is like the Para Aduma. He says, it purifies those who are far, but maybe it may have a negative effect on those who are already studying Torah. So you got to be careful. It brings purity and it brings impurity at the same time. Now, obviously, Shlomo HaMelech was the wisest of all people. So if Shlomo HaMelech couldn't give an explanation for this paradox, how dare we try to even give an explanation? Nevertheless, our Svarim have tried to offer a partial explanation of this. And this is from the Sfas Emes, the great Hasidic Rabbi, the Sfas Emes. And he says the following. Let's think about the institution of Tuma. We translate it as impurity, although it's not quite the right definition. It has nothing to do with hygiene or anything like that. Tuma comes from death. All types of tuma comes from death. The obvious tuma of contact with a dead body is contact with death. But even less obvious tuma is connected to death. A seminal emission creates a one-day tuma of mikvah. You have to go to the mikvah. That's because, once again, a seminal emission is a loss of a potential life that could have been created. A nida has a status of tuma because the shedding of the uterine lining also represents a potential pregnancy that did not take place that time. Touching a dead animal is a form of tuma, although not with the severity of a human corpse. So tuma very much correlates with death. Now let's think about this for a moment. Death came into the world. Death was not the natural state of God's world. God created Adam and Chava to live forever. And the only thing was, after they rebelled against Hashem by eating from the fruit of the Eitz Hadas, the tree of knowledge, Hashem then decreed, we have to kick them out of Gan Eden, lest they eat from the tree of life and they live forever. Meaning the ideal plan actually was an amazing thing. Adam and Chava only had to wait to Shabbos. They were created on Friday afternoon. They were commanded not to eat from the tree of knowledge. But it's brought down in Sfarim, the Arizal says, if they would have waited until Shabbos, the Eitz Hadas would have been permitted, and then they would have eaten from the Eitz HaChaim, and they would have lived forever. But they jumped the gun. And because they jumped the gun and rebelled against Hashem, they get expelled from the Garden of Eden. And they no longer have the Eitz HaChaim. And death came into the world. So it's pashut from the narrative of the Chumash itself that death came into the world as a result of rebellion against God. That death was not part of Hashem's original plan. And that is why Chazal tell us, at the time of Matan Torah, when we reached the level of Adam Harishon before the sin, we actually had immortality until the Chet HaEgel, where we lost it. Now, what was the origin of the rebellion of Adam and Chava against Hashem? Now, you might be tempted to say, well, it's probably taiva. They saw a nice fruit, etc., so they had a taiva. Rav Tzadok says no. The actual origin of the chet was a desire for kavod, honor, glory. Because the Nachash said, the day that you eat this fruit, you will be like God who knows good and evil. The Eitz Hadas was marketed as a God pill, whatever that means. Imagine somebody gives you this pill and says, take it and you will be God, even though God told you not to take it. We might be very tempted. The ultimate ego trip. To be Hashem, to be all-powerful, unlimited power. Now, the truth of the matter is, the human being is very godly. We are made in the image of God. And being made in the image of God certainly does not mean a physical image. Hashem does not have a nose, eyes, but it refers to spiritual qualities. We have powers of free will, autonomy, intelligence, the ability to create and to innovate and then to destroy. Meaning, certainly it's an infinite miniaturization of God. But in a sense, we are mimicking God in all of the creativity that we can do in the world. So we are godlike. But we have to recognize our subservience. We have to recognize that we're very much the junior partner. Death came into the world as a result of man trying to replace God by becoming God in their own minds. Seen in this way, death is not so much of a punishment as it is to remind the human being that there is an unbridgeable gap, an unbridgeable chasm between the Creator and the created. No matter how godly you are, you're mortal. Death is the ultimate reminder. I'm not God. I am not God. I don't live forever. So, it turns out that death came into the world because of arrogance, conceit, egotism, hubris. That's what brought death into the world. So, Rav Tzadok explained, Rav Tzadok and the Sfas Emes together, they have similar thought here. They explain the following. Because death came into the world because of hubris and arrogance, and that hubris and arrogance resulted in my being expelled from the Garden of Eden, every time I encounter death, I touch death, it's kind of reconnecting me to that sin, and I get re-expelled from Gan Eden. What is the equivalent of Gan Eden in this world? The Beis HaMikdash. Meaning the primary consequence of being Tameh is you can't be in the Beis HaMikdash. It's an exact parallel. If Adam and Chava's arrogance brought death into the world and that necessitated their expulsion from Gan Eden, when I come in contact with death, I'm reconnecting to that sin. I become expelled from the lower Gan Eden. The lower Gan Eden in this world is the Beis HaMikdash. Now, This also explains why para aduma is the necessary purification ritual. Now, this will not explain everything. Why red? Why a cow? We're not fully explaining that. But why ashes? Ashes is a symbol of humility and submission. When Avraham Avinu declares that he's unworthy to pray to God on behalf of Sodom, so Avraham Avinu's language is, Anochi afor va'efer. I am dirt and ashes. Ashes is humility. So look at the association here. Death comes into the world because of arrogance, conceit, hubris, and ego. How do I become liberated from the impurity of death? By attaching myself to the ashes of humility, submission, hitbatlut, subservience to that which is greater. That liberates me from death. That gives me new life. That's a tikkun for the chet of the Eitz Hadas that came through kavod. It liberates me. It's very similar, lahavdil, although we have a medrash very similar to the Greek myth of the phoenix bird. The phoenix bird was a legendary bird in Greek mythology. It's burnt into ashes, and it rises from the ashes. This is an important idea. Now, the emes is, because the Greek myth is more known than the Chazal, I said it as a Greek myth, but the truth of the matter is I shouldn't have, because in point of fact, there's actually a medrash that describes the identical phenomenon, a bird called the nets, which once again rises from the ashes. And that's an important idea, because we sometimes think that when I'm humble, I'm destroying myself, I'm destroying my identity, I'm not assertive. The lesson here is, by kind of getting rid of the ego, you attach yourself to God as the ultimate source of power. And then you have life. From the ashes, you get purity. From the ashes, you get liberation from death. Again, maybe not from the immediate physical death that we face, but in a spiritual sense. Humility is not about destroying yourself. It's about creating yourself by getting rid of the egotism that truly destroys you from the inside. So, seen in this way, we can see how Para Aduma, with its emphasis on Afer, reminds us not to seek kavod, glory, ego gratification. But what about the paradox? What about the paradox? So Rav Tzadok and the Sfas Emes take this in a very beautiful direction. If Afer is a symbol of humility, just like there's matter and antimatter, or there are protons and electrons, there's good ashes and bad ashes. There are good ashes in which I recognize that God is the source of everything, and I live with humility and submission to God, and I dedicate my life to His service. But then there's bad ashes, where a person thinks they're worthless. They have no abilities. They're a failure. They're a zero. Now, on one level, superficially, you might say, oh, well, that sounds frum, that sounds religious. The person is modest and humble. But that's a destructive form of humility. That's the humility of despair, the humility of helplessness, the humility of hopelessness, the sense that I don't matter. And if you think about it, that type of humility, if we want to call it that, is really a Yetzer Hara. Because if I'm a zero, then what's the point of my mitzvos? What's the point of my davening? What's the point of my learning? What's the point? Who am I to make a difference in any way? And that is the greatest of the Yetzer Haras. to feel I don't matter. So that's the subtlety of the remez of Para Aduma. The ashes of humility can bring a person to the greatest purity. But when taken in the wrong direction, they can destroy you. It's like atomic energy, right? Atomic energy can give you all the power that you need, and it can also destroy the world. So we have to be very, very careful with this. If a person thinks he's nothing, he'll never accomplish what he's supposed to accomplish in the world. This is encapsulated in the famous statement that people often say it in the name of Chazal, but it's not from Chazal. It's from the 19th century Hasidic Rebbe, Rav Bunim Pershischa, even though people say it like it's a medrash. He says, a Jew, every person, has to have two ideas in his two pockets. One is Anochi Afar V'Efer. I am nothing. I am dirt. I am ashes. I am nothing. And in the other pocket, Bishvili Nivra Ha'olam. Because of me, the whole world was created, the whole universe. Hashem made many dogs and many cats and many cows and many lions, tigers, and bears. But he only made one man and one woman. And the Mishnah says one of the reasons is that each person must say, because of me alone, this would have justified the whole creation. Now that's not going to be arrogant, because the same way that I can say the world could have been created for me alone, that's equally true for you. So that's not an arrogant thing, but that's a thing that makes me recognize how important my life is. You know, Rav Yerucham of Mir, one of the great Balei Musar pre-World War II, Rav Yerucham Levovitz, once said, the person who is not aware of his shortcomings is a foolish person. If I think I'm perfect, I'm simply dumb. I'm just, ignorant. Obviously, we all have flaws and the like. But he said, the person who is not aware of their greatness is a tragic person, because he never has the tool. He will never be aware of the tools that he has to achieve his role in life. So you got to be aware, along with the Anochi Afar V'Efer, which keeps me humble. I have to have Bishvili Nivra Ha'olam. There's a similar thought with Rav Dessler. Rav Dessler, the great Mashgiach, while he was in England for a minute, while he was Lithuania, then England before World War II, and then the last years of his life, he was the Mashgiach of Panovich, one of the great, again, Balei Musar. In fact, just in terms of Sforim sales, his books, Michtav Me'Eliyahu, which in English is Strive for Truth, is actually one of the best sellers in the world of Jewish books. It's never been out of print, and it may have sold more volumes than virtually almost every other sefer, other than the basics like Siddur and Chumash. And the story goes that at the Chazon Ish's Levaya in Bnei Brak, which I think was 1953, I think. So there was a boy, a Panovich student, who was at the Levaya, and the boy was sobbing. He was crying over the death of the Chazon Ish. So Rav Dessler went over to the boy, and he said to the boy, why are you crying over the Rav, the Gaon, and the Tzaddik, the great Rabbi who's buried there in the ground? He then pointed to the boy. You should cry over the Rav, the Gaon, and the Tzaddik who's buried here in you. Because the Rav, the Gaon, and the Tzaddik who's buried in the ground became the Rav, the Gaon, and the Tzaddik. But how many of us have a greatness within us that we're never aware of, and we never become? And maybe it's easier not to be aware of it, because that creates less responsibility. That might be part of the dynamic also. If I'm a nobody, there's nothing I got to do about it, right? Etc. But that's kind of the lesson, and that's the paradox of the Parah Aduma. The ashes of humility are wonderful, but when it turns into depression, hopelessness, helplessness, then it becomes a negative, destructive force that brings Tuma into them. So this is kind of a panoramic view of the 4 Parshiot, in which Shekalim again helps us deal with jealousy. Zachar helps us deal with materialism and hedonism because of the coldness of the heart. And Para gives us a perspective on the meaning of kavod. And then we're ready for Chodesh, which is his chadshut, renewal. Because when we clear away the junk on the building site, the garbage, we're ready to build and construct a meaningful identity as we approach the holiday of Pesach. And Rav Tzadok makes the point that it's very, very important. Chodesh comes from Chadash. Chadash is something new. And that is when a person feels inspired after working through this negativities. You need to concretize the inspiration by taking a step, even a small step. Because inspiration as a feeling tends to vanish relatively quickly unless it's concretized into action. There was a famous American academic, kind of a child's prodigy, Robert Hutchins, who was the president of the University of Chicago at like the age of 25. So he was he was younger than many of his graduate students. And he was already president of the university because he was really one of the brilliant academicians. And apparently he was not taking care of his health that much. So somebody once said, Dr. Hutchins, do you ever feel the need to exercise? So the answer that he gave might be an answer that may be familiar to me, familiar to some of us. And he said, yes, I do. I do get that feeling every once in a while. But I know if I lie down for a few minutes, it will pass. So I don't let it bother me too much. And that's very true for exercise, for sure. And it's true for spirituality as well, because all of us have moments of inspiration. It could be after Yom Kippur, it could be the Pesach Seder, it could be our own weddings or our children getting married, it could be being at the Kotel, it could be being in Yerushalayim, right? The moments in which you just feel connected. But the thing is, unless you concretize it with some type of action, like, you learn, you daven, you reach out to a person to make a connection. Inspiration comes and goes, and it doesn't last. And that's the meaning of this last Shabbos, meaning after you've gone through this process of working on your jealousy and on your taiva and on your kavod, you have to be mechadesh, take a step, take a positive step, create some connection to spirituality that will concretize the feelings that you have, because that's very, very important. Inspiration is very short-lived. That happens again. It's an inescapable fact of life that there are moments of elevated feeling, but they do pass relatively quickly. We can't live on a sustained high all the time. But when we have those moments and we concretize it, then becomes part of us. And then we'll continue to go kahena v'chahena, as Pirkei Avos again tells us, mitzvah, geireres mitzvah, one mitzvah causes another mitzvah. Okay, before we break, I want to share with you one final thought about Parah Aduma, which is not connected at all to anything I said, but it's a really, really neat thought. And this is from the Apter Rav. The Apter Rav was one of the great Hasidic Rebbes of the 19th century. His book on Chumash is called Ohev Yisrael, the lover of Israel. And in fact, that's why the Apter Rav is often called the Ohev Yisrael. And part of why he's called that is like virtually every vort he has in his Sefer is about Avat Yisrael in some ways. So he brings a very enigmatic medrash that at first glance makes no sense. And the enigmatic medrash says, If you really want to understand Para Aduma, you need to understand Avas Yisrael. It seems to be a non sequitur. I mean, we talked about Para Aduma, but it's hard to understand how it's connected to Avat Yisrael. So here's what the Apterav says. You know, we did discuss the idea that the Kohen handling the ashes does become ritually impure for one day. Now you have to understand that if you're a Kohen in particular, becoming Tameh is a major imposition. For most of us, becoming Tameh is not a particular problem, except when we had a Beis HaMikdash during the pilgrimage festivals. But if you're a Kohen, you got a real problem, because not only are you disabled from going into the Beis HaMikdash, but you can't eat Truma when you're in a state of Tuma. So your wife made a nice meal with Truma vegetables and the like. If you're Tameh, can't eat it, can't eat supper, you're going to have to go out for pizza or whatever it is. So what's going on is this. When a Kohen is willing to inconvenience himself in order to help another Jew, that brings purity into the world. So the Apterav says, instead of looking at this as a contradiction, it makes him Tameh and makes him Tahar, it actually is a cause and effect. The Kohen's willingness to become Tameh, to help another Jew, is what brings purity to the other Jew. And therefore he says, if you understand what Avat Yisrael is, you will understand that when we sacrifice to help others, we make the world a better place. And therefore, instead of looking at it as a paradox, the Apterav says it's a cause and effect, because it's mitamei es hatahorim. The Tahor person is willing to become Tameh. That is why it's mitaher. That is why it purifies. So that's again something to remember, and I'll just end with where I began, that this is especially true around now when we have the obligation to give Mos Chitim, Kimcha de Pischa, to think about others. You know, at the Seder we announce, all who are hungry, come and eat. But you know, it's a little peculiar. We're sitting at our table already. The door is closed, even if it's a little open. But you know, nobody's gonna usually, sometimes not. Nobody's gonna show up. So we're making the announcement when we're pretty safe. We're pretty sure nobody's gonna show up the last minute. It expresses a value system, but right now we still have an opportunity to kind of make that a reality. So B'ezras Hashem, again, calling people to be generous, and wish you a wonderful, wonderful week and a good Parshat HaChodesh Shabbos. Thank you.
Yitzchak